Hey, right, everyone. We're just waiting for Will. Just bear with us. You all right, Shannon? Hey, right,
Evening.
Will. Happy New Year and all that. Getting bored of it now, so we'll keep it short. um, so usual stuff, guys, for tonight. Usual rules. Please don't put personal information in the chat. Just ask questions about as if they're about someone else. And if you do want to like the video and all that sort of stuff, feel free. We've got about I don't know, like 7 questions that have come in the last 2 weeks. Obviously, it's been 2 weeks since we did the last live stream, so there's quite a bit to get through. Plus, any questions that pop up in the chat tonight. So, without wasting too much time, we'll get into it. Um, just checking. So we're going to try and keep one eye on the live stream as it goes. So the first question we've had coming through the week is basically a fairly straightforward one, which is just about a question about the council's discharge of their duties into the private sector. And specifically, would the council potentially pay some of the rent? Now, I'm not quite sure. I'll give this question a bit of context so it makes a bit more sense. Basically, when a council has a duty to house you, it can do it in a number of different ways. There's two ways that we that would kind of definitely result in you getting housed. One is a final accommodation offer, which is an offer made within the relief duty period. Appreciate I'm using a lot of jargon here, but I'll try and keep it as simple as I can. And then you've got the main housing duty, which comes like once the duty's been accepted after that relief duty's ended. Now, councils can basically place you. I don't know if that's the right word. They can basically nominate you for uh, some sort of private rental accommodation. And the question is basically, I guess it recognises the fact that lots of private rented accommodation isn't affordable on the local housing allowance. And so the question is, would a council potentially pay some of that rent? And the answer is they could do. It just depends. Basically, particularly for a final accommodation offer that's made during the relief period, the accommodation only has to be likely to continue for 6 months. So it doesn't kind of, whereas the main housing duty into the private sector is at least a 12-month tenancy, it's a little bit worse. It's a lot more watered down within the relief period. But because councils are going to struggle to find private rented accommodation that's going to be affordable, they will consider paying that top up. It's going to be depending how they try to do that, because it's not going to be something they want to do indefinitely, which is why I'm saying that it might be more likely within the final accommodation offer route, because they, in one sense, after that 6 months, they might reconsider it or whatever, and they don't have that kind of longer term, kind of requirements. So that's the short answer. They could use a discretionary housing payment to do that, or they could do it in other ways. I don't know if there's anything else you guys want to add to that question that I've missed or I've got wrong. Yeah, it's as I say, it might seem like a strange thing for councils to do, but it might end up being the cheapest option for them. So they'll try and save money where they can. They might have other budgets as well, like spend to save budget or something like that, where it actually becomes in their interests to do so. What they can't do is put you into any accommodation which is unaffordable, which again is why, if they're savvy, they might consider paying a top up, particularly if it's a fairly minor top up, so that actually, so that it meets the requirement of being suitable for you to continue to occupy. So, unless we've got anything to add to that question, we'll get on to the next one.
Yeah.
Just going to check the live chat for a second. Um, so, question two. This is a question about the local housing allowance. How can you become eligible for a one-bedroom flat in London as a 25-year-old, or as someone who's over 25 years old, a single adult? So I've actually done a video about this on the YouTube channel, which I list the exemptions. Basically, in the private rented sector, so this doesn't apply to social housing, but in the private rented sector, you will only get the shared accommodation rate up until the age of 35. So once you hit your 35th birthday, you'll be eligible for the one bed rate. So as in, you'll have a self-contained flat, or you'll be able to kind of be eligible for that amount. But there are some not strange exemptions, but there's a number of exemptions that would apply to you if you're aged 25 or over, or even particularly potentially lower than that as well. And I'm not going to get all these right. So if you just search for, trying to remember the name of the video I've done, it's got like what is the local housing allowance or something on the channel. But basically, there's things like, if you spent 3 months of your life at some point, or multiple points, in supported accommodation, then you'll apply for, you'll kind of meet the criteria for the exemption. So that means you'll get the one bed rate when you're 25 rather than 35. If you've been a victim of domestic abuse, as in like kind of I can't remember what evidence they require. It's not a particularly high threshold, but if you can evidence that you've been a victim of domestic abuse at some point, then you'll get the one bed rate. I think care leavers in certain situations also would do. There's some other exemptions. I think there's one for MAPA. So if you are deemed to be a risk or high risk to other people, you would get the one bed rate. I'm probably missing out one or two there, but yeah, basically that. Yeah, check out the video because I'll go into it in more detail, and I do a really reasonably good job of kind of listing all those exemptions. But as I say, it only applies to the private rented sector. And the bottom line is, in a lot of areas, the local housing allowance won't cover the market rent anyway. It's just not going to be high enough. There is some there is a kind of strange kind of nuance to this, in that once you hit your or let me try and explain this correctly. If you're eligible for a 3 bed house, let's say, just to kind of give this example, but there are no 3 bed houses which are going to be affordable in the area, you would be able to you'd still be able to get the 3 bed rate even if you moved into a 2 bed property. Now, this might seem like a strange thing to say, but for a lot of people, they would rather be in overcrowded accommodation than no accommodation at all, which is fair enough. And so what that means is you'll be eligible for the rate that you're eligible for on paper. You'll get that amount or up to that amount, even if you're not in that size property. I'm hoping that kind of makes sense. Again, I do a better job of explaining it in the video. But again, anyone want to add anything to that at all?
I've been trying to put a link in the comments to the shelter page, which has a list of the exemptions, but my link doesn't look very user friendly. I'm just going to put a new link.
Yeah, cool.
But that's on their website.
So, and presumably if you just Google shelter plus local housing allowance exemption or something, it would pop up, yeah?
Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking you might, if the link's too long, it might not actually fit as a comment in the chat because then you're restricted to the number of characters.
I think as well, it's probably worth pointing out that if you want to know the exact rate, it varies, obviously local. It varies from area to area. But again, you can just Google LHA rates and then you type in your postcode or local authority, and it will tell you the exact rates for each bedroom and stuff. I know it's often a situation where people feel out of control, and that's one thing you can just look up yourself. It's all there on Google.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So some local authorities will just have one standard rate for the whole authority area. Other local authorities will have multiple LHA rates within their district and they kind of subdivide it. So yeah, I mean, generally the closer you are to London, the higher it will be. But as I say, it's likely to not be enough to actually cover most of the rental market that's going to be available to you. So that's why, as I say, councils might consider actually topping things up just to increase options. So I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. I'm not sure if we've got any questions coming in yet. We've got a couple of comments there. If we've got any regulars in tonight, please say hi and happy New Year and all that. Next question we've got is the government obliged to house pensioners if they're homeless? So we'll take. I'm ignorant of this. We're going to take pensioners as someone who is age 65 or over, just to kind of keep it simple. I don't know what pension wage is these days. Might be higher than that, but so basically, it's a question that kind of straddles a number of different areas. So I think let's tackle priority need first of all. So a council has a duty to provide you with interim accommodation if there's reason to believe that you might be homeless, might be eligible, might be in priority needs. And then they'll have an actual duty if you are homeless, eligible, and in priority needs. So if they're satisfied you actually are. One of the categories of priority need is vulnerability, and the code of guidance does talk about age as being a potential source of vulnerability, but there's no set age at which you become in priority need or you automatically become in priority need. So you don't hit your 65th birthday and then you're in priority need, whereas you weren't the day before. It's always a case of just how your age is affecting you, and really in the real world, what that means is how you might have some age related health issues that kind of come into play, but in my experience, age on itself is not going to be enough to get you over the line, because you're likely to have other health issues, which are the things which actually make the difference for you. I can't really think of a situation unless you've got, in one sense, you have Ranulph Fiennes who's just walked across Antarctica and he's well in his 70s. That's you could argue he's not vulnerable because he's fitter and more robust than most of us would be. So yeah, that's so there's no set age. What I would say though is that if you're over the age of even 55 or 60, there's generally a lot more accommodation available through the council. So, and my experience is fairly limited to Bedford in this respect. But in Bedford, the waiting list for older people's accommodation is pretty short. I've got people housed the next day before in years gone by, because there's almost like a number of voids in that kind of age range. So the answer is the council is not obliged to house you if you're a pensioner, but it may well have a duty to. You may also be able to benefit from duties under the Care Act. But again, if you've got care and support needs arising from your age, if you're not eligible for assistance, just to point out that you won't be eligible for any housing assistance at all under the Housing Act. So you might have someone who's let's say they've recently arrived in the country, they're very old, they're very vulnerable, but that doesn't mean to say the council have a duty to you under the Housing Act to actually house you. Again, you might be able to get housed under the Care Act or something through respite care or something, but it's not automatic. Again, have I missed anything with that one, guys?
No, I don't think so.
I'm aware I've got a very yappy dog in the background, so I apologise if you can hear anything. There's some foxes in the garden. I'm in London, so there's lots of foxes everywhere here. And so he's obviously kicking off. So questions coming in the live chat. If you ask for it, is the council obliged by law to give you your housing file during the review process? So when we talk about housing files, we're talking about basically your records that the council has about you. And the short answer is yes, they are obliged to under the Data Protection Act. So that's going to come into play with one of the other questions we've had come through during the last fortnight. But basically, any personal data that's held by an organisation is accessible to you through the Data Protection Act. So it's called the right of access. And basically, it's a little bit like homeless application. You don't need to fill in a prescribed form to get the data. You just need to ask for it in any particular form. It's obviously sensible to ask for it in writing via email, but it's not actually necessary. And at that point, they've then got 30 days to provide all the data you request. So you might want to just say, well, can I request my housing file? Or you might want to be a bit broader and say, well, actually, I want all information held by the council. You can do that. But you're going to get a whole load of stuff which isn't much help to you, like council tax file, records and stuff like that, which you don't really want. So you can be specific and say, I want my housing file. They've got 30 days to provide that, which obviously might not kind of coincide with the timescale that you're working to within the review. So you can request it, and they absolutely can provide it in a much shorter period of time. I've certainly worked in reviews before where we've requested an extension because the council was taking so long to provide the file. So you can also do that. So although they only have to give it within 30 days, it's sensible for them to give it as soon as possible, because that then gives you a chance to kind of put your representations in for the review. There are some very extreme examples where the council get up to 3 months to provide the file, but that's where it's really, really tricky. I've only had that once before, and that was where a client was, there's a whole load of legal proceedings going on with the council, and she was known to lots of different departments, so it's they took a while to actually collate it all. But yeah, so I don't know yet. Again, I don't know if you guys have got a different or an additional answer to that.
I guess just a bit of like more practical, emotionally sort of advice, because I've read files about myself that professionals have written. It's not always lovely reading. Sometimes the way that they'll write about you, and it might not even be intended to be blunt and horrible or whatever, but just if you're requesting your own files, brilliant. It's such a powerful, useful tool. Just be prepared that professionals' notes aren't always written in the nicest way, and not always in the best light. And with everything else you might have going on, that sometimes can just be like the final straw. So I just want to give you a heads up that it's not necessarily easy reading. That's it from me.
Yeah, you've also got a right to restrict, and you've got a right to, what's the word? It's not amend, but it's something like that. So basically, under the Data Protection Act, you've got a right to tell the council where they've got something wrong. You can tell them to correct their records, or you can tell them that you don't want them to process the data in a certain way, provided there's certain reasonable kind of bits to that. But right. So Shannon's been there, right to rectification. So so if you're ever going to write a complaint or kind of put a complaint into the council, then I would highly recommend requesting your file anyway. because as Shannon says, you get it warts and all, and often there's going to be kind of aspects to that record which provide you kind of smoking gun evidence of failures. So it's well worth doing, with that caveat of it can be quite unpleasant reading sometimes, because the councils might have made unfair risk assessments of you, or they might have shared data in a way which wasn't lawful and was kind of you object to, which you can complain about, but it's still kind of, it can be quite upsetting. So it's something just to kind of bear in mind if you're going to do that. But I would say, certainly as a caseworker, as someone who's going to try and support people, those subject access request documents are absolutely essential. They're invaluable, and it's often so easy to pinpoint what mistakes the council made just by referring to their own records. So you don't have to worry about what records you've got. You can just go on their own records, and there's often failures kind of within the first few seconds of reading it. Basically, you can see whether things are starting to fall apart. So yeah, hopefully that's answered that question.
Can I add one little point to that? I think that if there is a review taking place, then the council are obliged to give you a copy of the file if you ask for it as part of the review process. So if they said, no, we're not going to give you the file, or you've got to wait for a certain period of time and we're going to carry out the review in the meantime, that would be a ground for appealing on the basis that they haven't given you the file, so you couldn't properly prepare the review.
Well, that's helpful. And is that written down in the code of guidance at all?
There is case law on this. I was just looking around for it, but I couldn't find it. But it has been held that where the file is available, then failure to provide it would be unlawful, and it would be an error of law. And failure to carry out a fair review. I've never had a case where a council has refused to send me a file, and they will normally send me the file. What I normally do is, if I ask for a review, I'll say, please, can you carry out a review? Can you send me a copy of the file? I'll make that a subject access request, and I'll say, can you allow me 14 days from the date when I get the file to make representations?
Yeah.
And I've never had anyone say no.
So I just wonder, like, just thinking aloud, really. So if you say you've got that right to request a file, I would still put a subject access request in, because with most subject access requests, or certainly a lot of them, the council will accidentally not give you the bit of information which is actually the most helpful to you. So often when my most recent complaints I've got upheld, I had to go back to the data protection team and kept saying to, yeah, but you haven't provided all the information. Here's another thing which I know exists. You need to provide that and anything else. So they end up having to kind of be chased to actually provide you everything. As I say, conveniently they might not give you the bits which are actually the most helpful to you. So I'm just thinking whether that might be worth just kind of bearing in mind as well, just to make sure you belt and brace it and you've definitely got all the information. Because I'm if you ask for a housing file, I don't know, they might omit things from other departments that would obviously be helpful. So for example, you might have a contact with social services or something, they might omit that from the housing file or whatever, potentially legitimately. But if you make the subject access question, you make sure you've got all that basis covered. Let's just go to the live chat for a minute. We've got a few coming in. So thanks for asking questions, guys. Relative was denied housing from the council when homeless and was asked private rent, but is now homeless again as little landlords accept housing benefit. Can the council help anymore? So there's probably I get again, guys, just kind of fill in any gaps. I'm saying that there's kind of, largely speaking, the way this all works kind of hinges on whether you're in priority need or not. So there are duties to people who are in priority need. There's duties to people who are not in priority need, and there's also duties to people who we're not sure yet, but we think they might be in priority need. There's kind of that crossover as well. Now, if you're not in priority needs, the council has to, and Will's going to fill in my gaps here. There's certain things the council has to do. They have to carry out an assessment of why you're homeless, what type of accommodation you need, and what support you need if you're going to get housed again. They have to co-produce a personalised housing plan with you, which could be, if they did it properly, would be a really useful document. But often it's just a template. And they have to take reasonable steps to assist you into housing. I can't remember the exact wording of it, but that falls short of actually saying they have to house you. Now, I know Will probably takes a different opinion on this one to me, but because he's a solicitor and he's got a bit more teeth than me and Shannon do. So But certainly, the council can basically say, well, we tried a little bit. We said we gave you a list of landlords. We told you about some hostels, and now 56 days are up, so we're not going to, we don't have to do anything else, and so they end that duty. So that's why priority need is so important to those housing duties under the Housing Act. Let me just explain that jargon as well. There's duties like councils have to give advice and assistance to everyone. That's a duty, but it's not a housing duty, if that makes sense. It's all under the Housing Act. But when I talk about housing duty, I'm talking about a duty to put a roof over your head, either in temporarily or in the long term. So, yeah, guys, you want to just kind of take over from where I've got to there, because I'm just trying to think, yeah, kind of what else is going to be relevant for this situation.
Shannon, do you want to jump in first?
If not, well, so I'm just going back to the question to make sure I'm not kind of going off on a tangent. So, yeah, the question. Sorry, I was going back to the question. So, they've presumably made a homeless application before the council's denied council housing. I'm assuming that means. So, just to kind of emphasise that councils can use private rented accommodation as a discharge of their duty. So you're not guaranteed social housing if you make a homeless application, even if the main housing duty is accepted. So they've gone into private rented. They've, I guess, presumably become homeless again, because there's so few options. Can the council help anymore? Well, so if you're homeless again, you can make a fresh homeless application, or if your vulnerabilities have increased in the meantime, so that you're now in priority need, or you might be in priority need, you can make a fresh homeless application. So the council can help more. As I say, this is really what the Homelessness Reduction Act was trying to do, is trying to get councils to help people practically to find their own accommodation where there isn't a duty to actually put a roof over their head themselves. So, yeah, the short answer is yes, the council can help. A more pertinent question is, does the council have to help you? That's probably the key thing, because any council can house you if they want to. They're strapped for resources, and therefore they will only house people they actually have a duty to house generally, although there are exceptions to that as well. Shannon, I don't know if you're unmuted there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess it also depends on whether they're eligible, because it might be that they were denied housing and sent to the private sector because they weren't eligible, by which we mean like British citizen, and you've got the settled status, and it might be, or could it be, intentionality? In which case, if you had an intentional homelessness decision made, and that's why they were like, just private rented sector, if you have then had that settled accommodation, that break the chain of causality, which means you would still be able to make a fresh application. So if you were to go down to the local authority and they were to say, oh, no, we made an intentional homeless decision 8 months ago, 6 months ago, whatever, you can say, no, I've had a tenancy since then. We need to start the whole process again. Please accept my homelessness application. That was only my thought.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So so adding to that as well. So there are also other situations which might break the chain of causation. That's that kind of the technical term. So Shannon's saying the councils, when they try and work out if you're intentionally homeless, their job is to find out where was your last settled accommodation, and that kind of opens up another can of jargon. But so basically, I've got my dog barking again now. Not my dog, anyway. Probably a yappy little thing. Anyway, so yeah, so basically, there are other situations which isn't settled accommodation, which might still kind of prompt that duty to make it or to take a fresh application. There was one where like a family stayed in a B&B for a year, and although it wasn't settled accommodation, it was enough to kind of start that process again to get the council to reach a fresh decision. Sure, the questions are coming out. I'm losing track now. So yeah, the short answer, yeah, the kind of the pragmatic answer to all this is email to the council. This is a homeless application. Restate the individual's situation. You can ask for previous decisions to make sure the council actually did reach a decision, because one of the main things councils do to get rid of people, to gatekeep, is just to tell people verbally, oh, there's nothing we can do. You need to go to the private sector, and actually give nothing in writing at all. So you want to see if those letters are on their file, and then just start the process again on the facts that you've got now. Next question. I think we've covered that previous one. What is involved when the council discharges you into the private rented sector? Is this common? Oh, I've just lost a bit in the screen now. Is this common? Will the rent be similar to if I rented privately myself? Well, the rental amount will be the same. There's no reason why it would be higher or lower. Now, councils frequently do discharge people into the private sector because social housing is waiting lists are ridiculous. And the way they do that, they'll have a relationship with many landlords in the area, and they will nominate people. So when a council is deciding whether they put you into the private sector or the social housing sector, one of the things they're really looking at is, are you going to be a good tenant? Because they don't want to mess up those relationships with those landlords by providing someone who potentially is not too good at managing a tenancy. So there would be people that they might be more likely to push towards the private sector, and there will be people who they're more likely to push towards the social housing sector. So when it comes to kind of social housing, if you've got large amounts of rent arrears, that would be a reason why councils would try to get you into the private renter sector, because they might have to clear those arrears to actually get a social landlord to actually accept you, where they're not landlords themselves. Again, another complicated concept here is that some councils have all of their own housing stock, some councils have none, and all of the social housing is through housing associations like Stonewater or whoever, kind of various ones around the country. It's common. Yes, it's common. As I say, I've mentioned already, there's 2 points at which the council can discharge a duty into a private sector. One is in the relief duty stage. So you make a homeless application, the council's satisfied you are homeless, you are eligible. The relief duty starts ticking, so you've got 56 days, and in that period they can find suitable private rented accommodation for you, and they can say this is a final accommodation offer. Essentially take it or leave it. Now, if you're going to be owed the main housing duty in the future, it isn't actually the end of the road for you, but in your situation it's sensible to accept it, because a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. Sorry to throw so many twee little sayings into this, but yeah, so they can do it at that point. It has to basically be suitable accommodation, so it can't be unaffordable, it can't be with a dodgy landlord who's got a criminal history, all that sort of thing. It has to be a right of proper person, or whatever, they're fitted proper person. So they can do it at that point, or they can discharge the duty, the main housing duty. So the relief duty ends, the council says, yes, you are homeless, yes, you are eligible, yes, you are in priority needs, no, you're not intentionally homeless. And the council can then say, well, we owe you the main housing duty, but we're going to discharge it into the private rented sector. There's a couple of things which make it slightly better than the final accommodation offer. One is that the tenancy has to be for at least 12 months rather than a 6-month tenancy. And there are some additional protections if you were to become homeless from that unintentionally again in the next 2 years, but that's a bit of a kind of an obscure bit to it. But they can do that. And again, things like, again, just kind of, if you're a couple without children, you're almost certainly going to end up in private rented accommodation, because it's more likely to be affordable for you because you've got 2 incomes rather than 1. So things like that. So again, guys, am I missing anything out here? Anyone want to add anything to that? I'm hoping I've answered the question there.
I think you covered it all.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so next question. What short-term and long-term help is there for a male with multiple health conditions who has suffered from domestic abuse at home in London and has also been asked to leave? So from a legal point of view, domestic abuse is really straightforward. If you're at risk of domestic abuse in your home, you don't have to have
There
fled.
is a follow-up question there as well, Mike.
Oh, let me check I've got it all. So the kind of follow-up question effectively about local connection. So let's go back. Yeah, let's go back to the starting point. So domestic abuse is not just physical violence, it's economic, financial, sexual, so-called honor-based abuse. I missed a few there as well. So anything like that, if you are in a home and it is likely that remaining there will lead to a risk of further domestic abuse, you are already homeless. You don't need to flee. So at that point, before you've fled, before you've given up that tenancy or whatever, you can go to any council in the country. In England, we're talking about here. I guess you can go to Wales and Scotland, but we'll worry about that later. So you can go to any council in the country and you can make a homeless application there, email them, I'm homeless, I'm experiencing domestic abuse, can you help me out with housing? That triggers the homeless application. That council then has a duty to put you into interim accommodation. The more evidence you've got, the better, but technically you don't really need any evidence at all other than your word. So council's default position should be to believe victims who disclose they've been abused. That's what the LJO says. And so you can approach any council, they put you in interim accommodation. They would then, once they've kind of got to that stage, they can then say, do you have local connection there? And you say, well, no, I've never been here before. I've just fled here from another area. That council can't refer you back to your home area unless it's safe to do so. So if you're at risk in your home area, you fled to another area, that other council can't refer you back to your home area. That's just the way it works. And if they tried to, then that your home area council can say, no, we're not going to accept this referral. The person's at risk here, therefore, that's the end of our, we're not going to get involved. So yeah, if you're at risk of domestic abuse, you can basically go to any council in the country, and if you're eligible for assistance, so if you've got recourse to public funds, as Shannon said earlier, that any council you approach is going to basically have the main housing duty to you, almost certainly. I can't really think of any situation where it wouldn't do. So that's, as I say, that's the legal answer. In the real world, councils are still terrible with, or a lot of councils are still terrible with dealing with domestic abuse. They still gatekeep people, leave people at risk of abuse in their own homes, and so on. And all I can say about that is complain, go to the local councillors, MPs, or whatever, put a formal complaint into the chief exec, and hope you kind of get somewhere with that. So again, guys, what else have I missed out with that?
I would just add, I mean, forgive me if you said this, because I was just reading the comments. Domestic abuse is wider than you might expect in terms of both the activity that is described as abuse. In the old days, it used to be that you'd sort of have to turn up with a black eye or something. But now it can cover anything. It doesn't have to be physical violence. It can be coercive behavior. It could be economic behavior. It could be basically controlling anything that sort of you think is sort of out of order within reason. And the second thing is, it doesn't have to be somebody in your immediate family. It used to be that they would have to be your sort of wife, husband, or wife, or common law partner. But it can be anyone in your household and also outside your household. So it could be a neighbour. It needs to be somebody known to you. And excuse me. The other significant thing is that having been exposed to domestic abuse is now gives you priority need. I haven't yet tested this because it sounds too good to be true. In that, if you think that if you had a neighbour who sort of behaved in a verbally abusive way towards you on a regular basis, would that give you a right to be rehoused in any other borough? I mean, actually, no. The test for local connection is that at risk of violence in the borough, isn't it? It's not abuse, or is it abuse?
The wording's really weird. So it's risk of violence or threats of violence that are likely to be carried out. So So I don't quite agree with you on that one, Will. So with domestic abuse, when it talks about this dog is killing me. But anyway, with domestic abuse, so you've got domestic abuse, and then you've got this other very closely related thing like harassment, like abuse from neighbours. Now, if you look at the cross-departmental definition of domestic abuse, it specifies it has to be from an associated person, which, as Will says, could be someone outside your household. So, but more like it's someone who is related by blood or marriage, or kind of you've been in a relationship with them before. So I would say just a neighbour on themselves wouldn't qualify as domestic abuse, but could still qualify for the same help effectively, in terms of it could render you homeless, and so on. So I think, so there, if you Google, I'm just trying to Google it a bit now. So it's the key term is associated person in domestic abuse, and it basically just lays out the Homelessness Code of Guidance does it within like 21.7 or something, paragraph 21.7, something like that. So if you look at there, you've got like a list of people who it apply to. But yeah, as Will says, even if it's not in that category, you can still get help from a council. Just going back to that original question, and this person's also been asked to leave. In one sense, that isn't relevant necessarily in the situation, because the domestic abuse in itself already does what it needs to do in terms of getting you housing assistance from a council. So the fact you might be asked to leave doesn't really come into it if there's domestic abuse involved, because you're already homeless because of it. So again, this is where councils. Oh, go on.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say it could be quite useful though. Now I don't want to stereotype, but the person said it was a male who was experiencing the domestic abuse. And men are less likely to come forward when experiencing domestic abuse. So if the person was uncomfortable going to the local authority and saying that they're experiencing domestic abuse, actually them being asked to leave, coupled with their medical conditions and the fact that they're signed off work because of disabilities, that could be another way for you to tick those boxes of, being eligible, being in priority need, and everything else without you having to disclose domestic abuse. Now, it's so easy for me to sit here and say like, oh yeah, I think you should tell them that you're experiencing domestic abuse because it's so legally wise, it's such a golden ticket almost, and you could change areas if you needed to or felt you wanted to. At the same time, if you're not getting sort of a lot of other support or potentially, not working with many professionals or whatever it is, that might be another route into getting that priority need, is focusing on the medical conditions, how they affect you day to day, how they would affect your ability to cope with homelessness, and the fact that you've been asked to leave. As long as that's in writing and sort of formally done, it's going to be a harder battle, but just one that might be worth mentioning. Sorry if you've already sort of said that stuff.
No, I haven't. So I didn't see that third comment. You're absolutely right. So it might, in the real world, it might just be easy to go down that avenue, at least to start the process, because it might be, if you get to know the housing officer and they're decent, you might say, well, actually, do you know what? There's some other stuff going on which I haven't been able to disclose yet. So domestic abuse is the council's responses vary so much from council to council. So some councils are great, some councils are awful, some councils, their own policy documents aren't lawful, so they'll basically have policy documents which you go and Google or something, and they'll say, oh, you need to have a letter from the police or a letter from the Marrick or something to, in order to get this help. And they've kind of mishmashed these different parts of, Part 6 and Part 7 of the Housing Act together. They've kind of got it all wrong. When it comes to evidencing abuse, as I say, the LGO is clear. Your word in itself should be enough to satisfy a council that you're at risk of domestic abuse. However, in the real world, because councils can be so bad at it, if you can get the additional information, so if you have been to the police, then okay, great, get kind of the crime reference number or something. If you can go to another support service, there might be specialist support services around for victims of domestic abuse that would be able to to kind of help and actually be able to evidence that stuff. There's something called a dash form, which technically you can do yourself, but a professional could do with you, just kind of evidence the risk or kind of assess the risk you might be at of remaining in the property, which can be helpful. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that should happen. I mean, just to kind of really labour this point, if you go to a counsellor and say you're being abused, not only should they kind of believe you for the purposes of the Housing Act, but they should also raise a safeguarding alert under the Care Act, and potentially a dash form, do a dash form. And if there are kids involved, they should also be making a referral to Children's Social Services for additional support from there. So whilst a lot of housing officers will try and dismiss it and push you out the door, there's actually a whole load of stuff they should be doing, just kind of according to their own policy. So if you're an advocate, check out what their policies say and pull them up on it. I keep mentioning it, but with Bedford Borough Council, they were not doing any of those steps. They weren't raising safeguarding alerts. They were just basically pushing people back out. And so we kind of FOI'd it. We used the Freedom of Information request to show how many people were actually being referred under that route, and there was zero in a whole year. So that highlighted a problem at a political level with them, and they improved. So the whole bunch of stuff you can do. And also it is worth, again, if you're an advocate, if you've got the headspace for it, just read up on their policies and just Google your council's name and domestic abuse and see what comes up. Because what you'll find is, whilst the housing options team might be looking, or the homelessness team might be looking to minimise the issues you're dealing with, there might be another department of the local authority which are great and are actually willing to help you out, and they can then provide that additional evidence that you might need to kind of have an easier ride with it. I think, again, hopefully that's again, just to kind of summarise all that stuff. If you're at risk of domestic abuse, you can go to any council in the country, and if you're eligible for assistance, so if you've got recourse to public funds, they will have they'll have a duty to house you, basically. And there are also some very kind of niche kind of duties that a council might have to people who are not eligible for assistance, but it's much more short term and a lot more difficult to get anywhere with it. But yeah, hopefully that's helped. Hopefully that's helped the situation. And again, just kind of keep it simple, put it all in writing, make sure you've got that paper trail when you're going to try and start this process with the council, because yeah, the old saying of, if it's not written down, it didn't happen, is really quite true for these processes. So next question is about, basically, is someone who is former armed services and has a diagnosis of PTSD, does this make them a priority need? So again, this is kind of one of the criteria of priority need, which is not automatic. So not every veteran of the armed forces will automatically be in priority need. The wording of the law says you're in priority need if you're vulnerable as a result of serving in HM armed forces. So and the fact you've got a diagnosis of PTSD here is going to make it fairly straightforward from a legal point of view, because I'm being presumptuous here, but my guess is the PTSD may well be related to the service, and so this is one of the kind of weird areas of law, and weird way this works out is almost it doesn't matter why you're vulnerable. If you've got, it's about the effects on you. So if you've got PTSD, it almost doesn't matter why you've got PTSD. In fact, it doesn't matter why you've got PTSD. If you've got PTSD, that's the thing which the council have to consider, and it's almost irrelevant why, as I say, why it arose. So the kind of, in a very quick summary of kind of the legal test for vulnerability, the easiest way to do it, so there's a case called Thomas v Lambeth, which is really helpful because it sets this out. First question is there something about the person which kind of basically stands out or kind of identifies them as a potential cause of vulnerability? So here, being in the forces, having a diagnosis of PTSD would tick that box. Would that issue, so would the PTSD be exacerbated by being homeless? Well, obviously, because PTSD is highly related to anxiety and stress, and homelessness is obviously going to be highly stressful. So yes, for that one. And is homelessness going to likely make that kind of lead to a risk of harm? And again, the worsening PTSD symptoms in themselves would probably would already cross the threshold for that. So yes, absolutely, I'd put any money on a person in this situation being in priority need. I'd also put a lot of money on a council basically just getting rid of you, unless you're willing to put it all in writing, get a decent advocate with you. You're actually, unfortunately, the more vulnerable you are, the easier you are to gatekeep and the easier you are to fob off. So without a kind of decent advocate behind you, it's going to be quite tricky to take on a council on your own. Certainly kind of the worst councils out there would push back a lot and just kind of minimize and say, the PTSD diagnosis isn't confirmed yet, or you're not taking this medication, or they come up with any old nonsense really to try and get rid of you. But don't give up. Shannon and I kind of, really are big fans of Expert Link. The chief exec there is in the same sort of situation, really going to ex-forces. And he said, the worst thing about being homeless was how he was treated as he made that homeless application, just kind of how things were just ignored and minimized, basically. So, yeah, if you can get a good advocate, you need one. It's going to make things much more straightforward for you. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Just quickly, yeah, if you do have PTSD and you potentially have any reasonable adjustments that come with that PTSD, for example, you can't answer the phone, you can't take phone calls, or you can't answer letters, or whatever it might be, you need private space, rather than like an open plan, whatever it might be. When you first make that homelessness application, it's really worth saying, I've got PTSD, and these are the reasonable adjustments I need you guys to make to accommodate my PTSD, and they do have to follow that because it's protected under the Equality Act. So just to add that in there, like stating it from the beginning is gonna really help your case.
And Will, you've kind of made that argument where someone needs self-contained temporary accommodation or something, yeah?
Yeah, I have. I'm going to say it's PTSD is going to be relevant as well to what sort of accommodation would be suitable if they do accept a duty. And hostel shared accommodation is generally not going to be suitable. I mean, it depends on the particular nature of it, but I think you could say that certain universal characteristics would be that you are jumpy and easily startled, you're tense, on guard, on edge, hypervigilant. Those are all things that living in shared accommodation is likely to aggravate.
Yeah, and linking this back to the local housing allowance we talked about earlier, not that this is directly relevant, but another category I missed out was if you're getting the care element
Yes.
of it. I think it's care element, and again, I think that's kind of making the same sort of argument. You know, if you've got personal independence payments for PTSD or something, it's kind of recognizing that you need your own space. So I know that's not going to win any arguments directly, but it just underline that idea of kind of needing to have self-contained accommodation. There's a very quick question, just follow-up question. Just what's the LGO? I've kind of realized I mentioned that a few times. The LGO is the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. It used to just be the Local Government Ombudsman, which is why I call it the LGO still, but it's technically the LGSCO. And it's like Ofsted or CQC, but for councils, and their job, they won't assess whether a council made the right decision. They'll assess whether the council reached that decision in the right process. So anything like gatekeeping is going to be an LGO, something that will come under the LGO. Now, to go to the LGO, you've got to exhaust the council's complaints policy first, which is usually 2 stages, sometimes 3 stages. So in the last quarter or so, I've got a couple of complaints upheld, resulting in compensation, basically. So we're not talking. We're talking a couple of thousand, maybe something like that, a few hundred, couple of thousand, depending what circumstances are. But as a learning tool as well, the LGO's website, so it's just lgo.org.uk. If you go on there and you search for the previous decisions they've made, there is an absolute goldmine of information about how councils should act, because when they make a decision, they first of all set out this is what the law is, and it's in real kind of easy terms to understand. That's where I started learning about this stuff, because it will set out, as I say, and not just homelessness law, but it kind of set out duties about the Care Act, about other areas of law that are kind of relevant, and kind of lead to a kind of a pretty holistic assessment of what went wrong. So yeah, it's a good resource.
Found their good practice guides almost to be better initially than the case studies, because the good practice guides have case studies in and they're easier to find. But they've got one on like suitability of temporary accommodation, domestic abuse, various bits and
general,
bobs.
yeah. Equality. So they're called. So if you Google LGO focus reports, you'll get, and then you kind of go to the subcategory of housing or homelessness or something, you'll get some really good. Again, there's chances real good resources about that. Which
you can also just search your own area and see what you might be up against as like a general. Obviously, they're supposed to make improvements once that decision's been made, but it might just give a bit of wider context too.
Yes. So yeah, if you search Birmingham and LGO, you're going to get like reams of decisions, because Birmingham seems to be the worst council out there. So yeah. Hey, right, Youssef, nice to have you here. Just kind of this question is, so someone homeless, 2 children, I think so waiting for court order. I guess they're waiting for the eviction process to go through. The council told me I have to find private property. How can they get social housing? So as I kind of said already, there's no way of kind of guaranteeing you get social housing. It's going to be a lottery of where you live, basically, and kind of what kind of criteria you meet. When you go to a council with any housing issues, you can guarantee the first thing council will say is, well, you need to go and find private rented accommodation. Now, we all know, and the council officer telling you that knows, that there's hardly any private rented accommodation around that's going to be affordable for anyone on benefits. And even if you're in kind of, low to medium pay, you're still going to struggle to find something. So it's kind of a default kind of response. This is why it's so important, if you're dealing with a council, to do everything in writing and make sure the homeless application has been accepted. And just to reiterate what I've already said, homeless application is simply asking a council for help with housing and giving them reason to believe you might be homeless or threatened with homelessness, which is a really low threshold. So that's kind of kicks off that process. If you don't make sure that process is kicked off, you will get any old nonsense out of housing officers, and they'll just basically say anything to get rid of you, and they'll just hope you won't come back. So I would never, if I was homeless, I wouldn't speak to a council on the phone at all, really. If I was going to go face to face with them, I'd probably record it or something, just to make sure there's a record of it. Because what happens in those conversations, those verbal conversations, is often not very legal. And if you then complain about it later, it's quite difficult to evidence who said what. And I've certainly had housing officers lie about stuff they definitely did say, but then they denied it. So yeah, so get it all in writing. It's a legal process. You know, if you are getting a divorce or, you know, up in court for a criminal offence or something, you would make sure that, you know, you had a written record of it, and you were kind of, you know, working within the kind of framework of support that's available to you. Same thing goes for homelessness. Make sure you're putting everything in writing. Make sure you can, you know, you get a solicitor if you can. I put it on the kind of the comment section as well today with the list that Will's done of solicitors that get legal aid for housing cases. So try and get a solicitor. If you can't get a solicitor, get an advocate if you can. Again, it's postcode lottery, but do what you can to get it. So yeah, I think that sort of questions in the chat at the moment, I think. So yeah, so I didn't fully answer that question actually. So how can you get social housing? As I say, you can't guarantee it, but by making that homeless application, you're maximising the chance of you getting it. What happens at the end of that homeless application? Let's say you are in priority need, so this person is because they've got dependent children. Let's assume they're not intentionally homeless, although a council might try and say that you are, but you know, argue it. The council then owes you a main housing duty. At that point, the council can discharge it into the private rented sector, but they will more likely than not put you onto the housing register, even if they then also offer you private rented. So you also need to check the banding of what you're going to get, and it's different in every area, which is why it's difficult for us to really kind of give you the right information. If you Google your local council's name plus housing allocation scheme, you'll get a policy. You'll get a PDF document which basically sets out their policy, and within it, it will basically say what banding you're going to get. So most councils will give the second highest banding to people who are main duty accepted, which you would be at the end of that process. Some councils don't. So, you know, Buckinghamshire, we mentioned before, gives you like almost the lowest banding if you're homeless or whatever. But that kind of gives you an indication. And you can also then request information from the council through the Freedom of Information Act, and ask the council for their average waiting times for each banding. So if this person, you know, a single parent, 2 children, you know, that obviously, you know, check out the ages. You can find out what banding you're going to be, and you can find out what size house you're going to need to, or what size property you're going to need to actually, you know, to be able to live there. You can then request that information of the average waiting times from that council through the FOI process, which again, if you just Google FOI, it'll come up. I did also see a question in there, which I missed. What is a subject access request? It's just a fancy term under the Data Protection Act for we're all data subjects. You know, we are the subject of the data. So you're the data subject. Subject access request is literally saying, you know, accessing your records, or the personal data that an organisation holds about. You can make it to any organisation, not just councils, and it's often very helpful. So yeah, as I say, that's all the questions on the live chat. There's some other questions that, guys, if you need to go, I think we're going to overrun. So don't need to apologise, because we've got like probably 5 more questions to do that are coming through the last fortnight. But let's get back to it. So we talked about pensioners. What is the process if you were to be found in priority need after 56 days? What would happen next? Would you be put on auto bid? Would you be in a high band? So I've already answered some of this stuff already, but basically the 56-day period is talking about the relief period, which is a waste of time a lot of the time. But anyway, so auto bid, I'll just explain what auto bid is. So auto bid, most councils, and again, this depends on the area, will give you a very limited amount of choice. If you're homeless, particularly if you're homeless, you basically have to bid on properties that are available through their bidding system. It'll be online, you know, every week or whatever. The ones I know, they're kind of every Thursday. The available properties get put on the system. You then log in with your details and you bid on properties. You know, you express interest in those properties, and basically the property will go to the highest. Well, technically it won't, but basically you'll get ranked according to your banding and how long you've been on the register. So everyone on band A will basically trump people on band B, and then 2 people in band B it will depend how long they've been band B for. So if they've been band B for a year, they'll trump anyone who's been band B for less than a year. Hopefully this all makes sense. And then you'll get shortlisted. Now, even if you win a bidding round, you don't necessarily get the property. It just depends then about after, you know, the checks that the housing association would then do. But auto bid basically is kind of, it's a colloquial term. where if you don't bid, so if someone who is, they're homeless, they have to bid. If they don't bid, and the council realise, they won't always realise straight away, you'll get put on this thing called auto bid, which is basically the council will just give you whatever. They'll just basically say, right, you haven't bid. This next property that comes up, we're going to give it to you. You're going to have it, and that if you don't accept it, then that potentially will end our duty to you. So that's kind of how auto bid would work. So as I say, some areas you get like maybe 3 bidding rounds to have a go. Other areas you would only get 1. So it just depends on the local council's policy. Other than that, I think we've probably covered the information in the other bits and pieces we've talked about tonight. Next question is essentially just a question about local connection and a child's education. So they live in one area and the child goes to college or school in another area. And the question is, do they get local connection through that? And the answer is no, not ordinarily. So you would get local connection through having family connection or having full-time employment somewhere, well, not full-time, but a permanent employment contract somewhere. Or if you lived there for a certain amount of time, but you won't get it through education, as far as I know, unless it is kind of, very specialist education or something for a child with a disability or something, maybe. I've not seen that myself, but it might come into the special consideration. I mean, councils can exercise full discretion on local connection. They don't even have to look at it at all if they don't want to, but they will do because they're trying to obviously restrict the number of people who get housed by them. So that's hopefully answers that question. This next question is really long. It relates back, if you watched the last live stream just before Christmas, we talked about someone getting their gas meter or the gas supply capped, and then that led to them moving out. That led to them being seen as abandoning their property, and that led to them being found intentionally homeless. Now, the person's come back to us and said, well, hang on a minute, the council knew about the gas being capped. They said they were going to respond to it. They knew about everything, basically, and now they're saying, oh, we're going to end our duty to you. Now, I'm not going to answer that question in too much detail specifically, but I just want to make a general point. You will often have situations which are really complicated, and you'll have dealt with multiple departments, multiple officers in the local authority who might all have told you different things, and that's then resulted in you getting stitched up and kind of getting left in the lurch. Going back to the subject access request process, it's so important that you make a subject access request for these kind of tricky situations, because you can untangle who said what when, because hopefully the officers would have recorded the information they gave you. They might have written letters to you or whatever. And you can also get from them the emails you've sent to them. So you don't have to show, you can just show them that they received those emails because they've got them on record. And that means you can potentially unpick those tricky situations and say, actually, you know what, I was upfront, I told you everything you needed to know. I haven't been, I've kind of been I've done everything I can do to kind of end this situation. That is why I'm now homeless. That is, and you then have a defense for being intentionally homeless or kind of, acting unreasonably or whatever, if you can then evidence it. You're going to get a lot of tricky situations, as I say. You're going to have housing officers who potentially aren't being honest about stuff, and unfortunately, I've worked in a number of complaints where, because we couldn't prove it in black and white, it wasn't upheld. I've had a case more recently where a housing officer told the client, if you don't accept this accommodation, we're going to potentially take your children off you. And the fact that they said that was upheld by the LGO when they actually made the inquiries, even though the housing officer denied it, that the LGO actually said on balance of probability that is probably what was said. But it's much harder to get anywhere with that. And then finally, we might finish your time. So what can happen after offering interim accommodation to disabled people after the homeless application? So I'm not quite sure kind of what specifically this question's kind of getting to. Any accommodation that a council offers you, whether it's interim, whether it's kind of longer term temporary, or whether it's final accommodation, has to be suitable for you, which needs to take into account your disability. So a council can't, if you, let's say a really obvious example, you're a wheelchair user, you can't get upstairs, a council can't give you accommodation with stairs, because that's clearly not going to be it's not going to be suitable for you. So the council has to give you suitable accommodation. Lots of councils haven't bothered to make sure there is enough of that type of accommodation available. So we're kind of fighting that issue in the moment with Bedford. because they basically haven't had any disabled or kind of level access temporary accommodation. So when someone approaches with a disability, they have to wait extra time to actually get housed, and that's something Bedford's now doing something about. They've purchased their own sort of accessible TA or whatever. But so yeah, I don't know. That's all I've got to say about that question. Really. I don't know. Do you guys have anything to add to that at all? I don't know what the context might be of it.
The only thing I would just add one thing, that when somebody is accommodated by a local authority, or when a duty is accepted, there's the need to carry out a housing needs assessment and personal housing plan, and that has to address whatever support people might need in maintaining accommodation, which might be what the person's asking is are they entitled to any support, as opposed to a full Care Act assessment. So yes, the council are under a duty to look at what support might be necessary, and then presumably put that in place.
Yeah, cool. Okay. There's a couple more questions just coming in the live stream. I was keeping an eye on. So there's just a question about someone who's basically been gate kept and left homeless for 23 months and sent in circles. Now, unfortunately, it's not that uncommon for this to happen. All I can say, so there's a question there whether me and Shannon can help out. That's kind of outside our roles. We're not in a position to do that. But basically, if you're in that situation, all I can say is if you just break it down into simple steps. So make a subject access request, lay out a timeline of what's happened. So when did that person first approach? What's the kind of what's kind of happened ever since? Make a complaint, go through the complaints process, although it can take anything up to sort of 18 months or 2 years to actually get the complaint upheld, whatever. It can often result in that person getting treated better in the shorter term. So if a council knows their complaints come in about a particular situation, they're more likely to actually deal with it properly. And ultimately, if you've been left homeless for 23 months, you're already looking at sort of £3,000 or £4,000 compensation for it before you even start adding in other issues with it. So that's something. And again, so Shannon and I run training about this, online training regularly. So our next date is 2nd of February. We've got another one 23rd of February or something. So that's just for anyone, members of the public or professionals, to kind of come in and get the training, which kind of covers this sort of stuff. But yeah, so it can be done, is all I can say. I've said this probably every time now. I'm a painter and decorator by trade. I don't sort of don't have any qualifications, neither does Shannon, that's relevant to this kind of stuff. But you can still get some really good outcomes for people. So don't give up, basically. Hey, you're right, Nick. And then finally, do local councils help with housing situations? Absolutely, they can do. There's some great councillors out there. They're often really helpful people to know. So again, something we haven't really said today, if you've got any kind of housing issue at all, make contact with your local councillor. If you go on your council's website, it'll be fairly easy to find, who is my local councillor, how to find out who my local councillor is. There'll be a section on that. You type in your postcode or whatever, and it will tell you who your local councillor or councillors, there's sometimes more than one, are for a particular area. Contact them. If they're decent, they'll be able to kind of, they won't be housing experts, but they'll be able to put pressure on the housing team to at least give you a fair assessment and kind of make sure things are going through. A real kind of standard thing to do is, if you've ever putting a complaint in about a particular situation, just to copy your local councillor in. And there will also be a councillor who is in charge of the housing department, effectively not in charge, but kind of they're kind of called portfolio holder for the service area that housing was within. Confusingly, it won't always be called housing, so it might be like community safety, or it could be adult services or something that kind of cover housing. But there will be some, the information will be on the website, and it's well worth kind of checking that out, because they can be great. So we've only run over slightly, which is, we've done pretty well to get through all that. Now is your very last chance to put any questions into the live chat, guys, because there's a 30-second delay. So you need to put them in right now, or we're going to miss them until next week. Any news from you at all, Will? Any gossip or anything?
Not really, no. I've been away and stuff over Christmas, so I've been a bit out of touch. But I'm hopefully back now, and I am back. But I'll hopefully have some more things to say after today.
Yeah, cool. Okay, Shannon, anything from you at all?
I don't think so. You've mentioned the training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
Are you gonna mention the?
I was going to say about so for the regulars, guys. So for the guys who kind of come to this regularly to the live stream, there's something you might be interested in. Me and Shannon are starting up just like an online little Zoom meeting every month or whatever. And it's basically we're gonna we're already kind of in contact with a lot of people around in different areas, and we're just going to basically just share information and share tips about challenging a council on particular issues around homelessness. So me and Shannon have already done quite a few videos about how a particular question asked to the council's housing committee actually resulted in a lot of good stuff. So I mentioned recently, just then about accessible temporary accommodation for people with disabilities. That's an issue that we've raised repeatedly. We've kind of used the democratic kind of processes within the council to get the information we needed, and then we asked questions about it. And that the council might deny it was us that did it, but the council is now purchasing accommodation for people in a wheelchair, which is kind of the purpose of doing it. There's 1,000 other things that can be done in that kind of similar vein. So I see Nick's here tonight. I don't know if Andrew's about. Youssef, I think I saw you in tonight. If you guys want to kind of get in contact just on the through Facebook or whatever, I don't know how you want to do it. You can use our training email, but you will only get a response if you're asking about this. So training at hbpconsultancy.co.uk. But yeah, just so that might be something you guys are interested. It's a plodding thing. It's not for those flashy people who kind of promise the earth and kind of don't deliver. It's for people who are boring like me and Shannon, and we're just pedantic and we just plod on with stuff, and we go after things over a long period of time. So this might be something that lasts 5 or 10 years, who knows. But yeah, it's just something which we think could do a lot of good, basically. So yeah, do get in contact with through one of those channels. Other than that, guys, we'll call it a week. Call it an evening. So I'm back next week. I don't know about you guys. Are you around next week? Will is Shannon is cool. Yeah. All right. Keep the questions coming in on the YouTube channel, guys. And if you're a professional, do look at our Facebook group, Homelessness Best Practice, because again, it's just somewhere you can ask technical questions about different things and get a sensible answer pretty quickly. But other than that, have a great week, and we'll see you next